Yeah, well, I think that there's this. Okay, how about now? Is it working now? Okay. So once I'm done with that, I want to have a discussion of street culture in India, and you'll see that it's a way of talking about the history of everyday life. I think that when we do contemporary history of this kind, or indeed even if we are not doing contemporary history, I think we should be aware of the fact that history is more than simply economic history, history of institutions, political history, military history. Those have been some of the predominant branches of history, but I think some of you are certainly aware of things like history from below, but also history of what the French used to call history of mentalities. But one important segment of that is the history of everyday life. And one way to study the history of everyday life is to look at street cultures. And this will be a bit of a segue, as you're going to find out, into the last segment, which is a segment for this week, and that's going to be on the idea of India and such things as globalization, the problem of the nation state, and so on. But before I begin formally with the lecture, I also did mention to you in the email that this is a week where I'll be happy to, beginning today, I'll be happy to take questions. Sometimes it's not possible to do that when we've got too much material to cover, but if someone has any questions they want to ask at the outset, or if you want to ask me in between, by all means do so. And one of the things that was sent to you with the email yesterday was a list of directions for the exam. I hope you had a chance to review that. Does anyone have any questions about the final exam at this juncture before I begin, about the nature of the exam and how you're supposed to submit it and all of that? Any questions at all about that? Okay, good. And are there any substantive questions arising from the material we've looked at until this point in time? Because we may not have time for a review session or anything of that kind. It's very unlikely that there's going to be any time left to do that. So if you do have any questions, Dominic?
The Nandi reading from this week talked about alternative frameworks of knowledge, essentially.
Yeah.
Could you provide an example of what one of those might look like?
Yes. So in fact, the subject matter for this week is going to be, one of the subject matters is going to be the distinction between the idea of India as a nation and the idea of India as a civilization. Right? What is a nation state? What are the origins of the nation state? Now, we're not going to do, obviously, a thorough history of that. But the nation state is essentially, as we know it today, it's a 17th century phenomenon. It goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia, and every nation state has really come about largely as a process of coercion, because people have to be cajoled into becoming the subjects of a nation state. There used to be a historian in our department here, very, very distinguished historian, passed away some years ago, Eugene Weber, and he has a book called Peasants Turned into Frenchmen. When did the French become French? A good portion of France did not speak French in the early 19th century. And if you read that book, one of the things you find out is that even in a country like France, where the ideals were set by the French Revolution, ideals of equality, liberty, fraternity, right? That all of these ideals also entailed, rather than contradicted, the processes of coercion. That you have to cajole and browbeat people into submission, into becoming subjects of a nation state, which means, among other things, that, for example, everyone has to be cajoled into speaking the same language. Okay? So the nation state is a particular way of imagining a community. It's a particular way of imagining a community, and it's not a way of imagining a community that has existed since time immemorial. Its origins can be pinpointed. And what the consequences of this are to be seen very clearly in places like South Asia. Because your question is, what would one of those frameworks look like? So one of those frameworks is that when we think of India as a nation state, you're not really thinking only of India. You're thinking of the nation state. And there is only one kind of nation state in the world. There's only one kind of nation state. That's the argument. Civilizations are pluralistic. And there are many kinds of civilizations. But there is only one kind of nation state. Okay? Now, countries may be nation states in varying degrees. But there is a modular form of the nation state. A nation state is an entity that enforces its borders through regimes of surveillance, passports. It has a national anthem. It has a national bird, a national animal. It links up the history to that nation state. It creates textbooks. It creates a homogeneous conception of who the subject of that state is. Whether that, if it's an American nation state, then it creates a homogeneous concept of what it means to be an American. If it's France, if it's China, that's exactly what it does. That's what we call the modular form of the nation state. Right? And so one of the alternative frameworks, therefore, that he's speaking of, and I'm going to be elaborating upon, particularly in my last lecture, is the difference between this idea of India as a nation state and the idea of India as a civilization. Right? That would be one of the frameworks that we can think about. Yeah. All right? But so I think That gives me a sense of you get the sense of what we're talking about. And of course, you'll see a greater elaboration of this on Thursday itself. Yeah. All right? Okay. Any other questions arising from anything that we have covered thus far? All right. So what I'm going to do now is I want to continue my discussion. Let me take you back to this slide here. Let me put it in the proper mode. And okay, it should be the other way around instead of you getting. Okay, 1 minute. Yeah, okay. So what we had been looking at was Deewaar. And you recall that in the concluding moments on Thursday, I had begun to show you some clips. So I'm not going to obviously reiterate everything that I mentioned before, but we had gone through all of these, the dialectic of the sword and the pen, the flight to the city. Remember that one of the constant running themes of this course has been, in small ways, I've been talking about the fact that the migration from the hinterland, from the countryside, from the interior to the city. Even the Neil Mukherjee book has a good deal of that, because who are all of these people who he's talking about? These are all people who have come from the rural countryside, and have now provided the labor market to the burgeoning city. And you remember that one of the early stories has to do with this person who is come from abroad, this affluent Indian, and he's living in his mother's place, and she has a cook and all of that, and then he decides that, well, he wants to go to the village because he's doing this cookbook. And lo and behold, when he goes to the village, now they suddenly have to, prepare for his arrival and all of that. But it is the village. Okay? So that's what I'm talking about, the flight to the city over there. Of course, in the film, it had a very specific reference, and that had to do with the fact that they escaped the oppression of the small town, usually the village, but in this case, the oppression of the small town, and then move to the urban area. And we had looked at such things as the idea of education, the problems of unemployment, the significance of writing, the figure of the mother, and then, of course, as I pointed out to you, the dialectic of the footpath and the skyscraper. Okay, so I want to look at a few more scenes here, but let me take you to the next aspect of this. So what we have here is a classic story, which is a story that you find in literature all over the world in many ways, but I have suggested to you that there is a particular particular way in which one can pinpoint its significance in India. And if you recall that one of the arguments I'd given to you was that many of these films are really displaced films about the partition in many ways. This one less so than some of the other films that I've mentioned to you, such as Amar Akbar and Anthony, where, as in many of these Hindi films, you have the theme of families that have been separated, and then usually there is a unity at the end. So here you have a contrast between two brothers, Ravi, who is educated, virtuous, middle class, and utterly boring, and then you have Vijay, who is uneducated, who is street smart, suave, falls into bad ways, but he's virtuous in his own ways. I would want to underscore that. He has a code of honor. I think we should, and he has a sense of integrity about him. And he is the closest thing that you can get in Indian cinema to a tragic figure. I say the closest things because one of the things that I've argued for you is that the idea of tragedy is something that Bollywood really doesn't understand. It doesn't understand it because if you look at classical Indian literature, unlike Greek literature, for those of you who know Greek literature, you know that along with the great philosophers, people like the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, and then the historians such as Herodotus, and most famously Thucydides, you have the Greek tragedies, right? Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. In India, in ancient Indian literature, there is nothing comparable to that. You have great writers. You have a great playwright by the name of Kalidas, but tragedy is not one of the aesthetic categories produced by Indian literature. And in the Hindi film, and Deewaar is a very good illustration of that, you have the other finally being reabsorbed. You know, that is that everyone is within the ambit of humanity, so to speak. That's one of the arguments that I'm trying to suggest to you. So it's not accidental, in other words, that Vijay is going to die, so to speak, in the bosom of his mother, right? That he's reabsorbed back into the human community from which he was exiled, from which he was ostracized. Well, recall his mother essentially basically throws him out or walks out of his home. Walks out of his home and elects that she's going to stay with the younger brother, right? That's what happens in the film, but then he's going to be reconciled back. And, you know, you constantly get this hint that the mother always actually really favored the older one rather than the younger one, all right? And then I had given you a kind of an analytical argument there, and the analytical argument was that Ravi falls under the sign of what you might call logos. The sign of logos means the whole idea of the reason, okay? The sign of assimilation, the sign of establishment in this case. He's a figure of the state. He works for the state. And Vijay, in that sense, is a person who falls under what I call the sign of mythos. In a manner of speaking, I'm using these in a kind of a looser way in order to be able to sharpen the distinction between these two characters. So let's just look at a couple of other scenes, because looking at these scenes helps us highlight some of the more interesting features of this film. And I want to take you to this scene over here, which is the scene at the temple. Okay, and just before that, okay, so let's start over here. Oops. Okay. All right. I'm not sure why it's not working. We'll have to just try it again. Nope. Okay. Let me see if this works. No, this is not working either. Do you have any idea how to switch it to the other screen? It's not working here. Usually it does, but So you see, this is the screen there, but I want it on this screen here. It should. It's connected. You know how to switch the screens over here? You're not sure? Okay. Well, you know, there is a. Let me see.
Maybe the mirror built.
Huh? Sorry.
The mirror display.
Mirror built-in display. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. There we go. Okay. Got it. All right. Okay. So, but we need to just go back now a bit. Okay, we'll just start watching from here. So you remember this scene here, right? I'm assuming that most of you have seen this film, that they're located to the city. The mother is working at a contractor's site. And remember, there's going to be a very flamboyant scene halfway through the film where this very building that she's been working on is going to be gifted by her son to her, right? So we'll just start from here. It's a little bit before I wanted to, but we might as well start over here. So by the way, I'm going to interject constantly so that you can see the compositions and understand what the scene is here. So this is a slum, right? It's a slum. Let me turn off the light so you can have a better look. And one thing you have to ask yourself, by the way, what is a slum? Right? The answer is not as clear-cut as it seems, because I would remind you of the fact that a slum is a certain social organization. Well, most people, of course, will have a common sense definition which will be quite different. So if you go to a place which looks ramshackle, run down, right, where you know that the working class are living and where there may be some element of risk or danger from the point of view of a bourgeois middle class person, and usually there's a large number of people congregated there, the living quarters are small. I think you understand, right? These are all the different things that go to making up a slum. But one thing you have to remember here, which is quite distinct about a slum in India in many ways, number one is that a slum in India always embodies forms of human communities just like all other areas which may be much better off. Right? In other words, that you know, a slum is not simply something that you say can be defined by its socioeconomic status as opposed to a wealthy neighborhood. That would be the more popular way of doing it. I'm suggesting to you that it embodies a certain form of human community. The other thing that we need to think about is that most of the people who moved into slums in India originally were people who had come from the rural countryside. So you come into the city, you have nowhere to live. And you typically go into a slum where the rents are cheap or where you can simply try to occupy a little corner on a street. Okay, now of course these slums, some of them have been around for 30, 40, 50 years. But there are some scholars who have given much more sophisticated analysis of the slums, where one of the things that they've tried to point out is that slum is that part of your history which you want to forget. That is, that what it represents is that part of the history of a country that the people who are well off would like to disown. They would like to obliterate the slum if they could. And you know what they do, by the way, when you have visitors coming to countries such as India and Pakistan. So, you know, let's say the President of the United States or the Queen of England or whoever visits. You know, every time they come, the street authorities will immediately remove the people from the slums and take them to the countryside for a couple of days. You know, to the extent that they can. Of course, they can't do that all over the city because Calcutta is 60% slums. I mean, that's over 10 million people. But, you know, if you know that the motorcade is going to go down, you know, such and such streets, you remove all of that. Well, during the Commonwealth Games in India in 2007, what they did was they placed massive billboards in front of all the slums to just hide these ugly buildings. Right? All right. So it is that part of yourself, if you do a psychoanalytic interpretation, that you want to disown. That's what a slum is. All right? And notice, by the way, the images in the back, these are all images of Hindu gods and goddesses. All right?
तो वो लोग क्या मुझे सर पे बिठाएंगे? तेरे पत्थर मारने से कुछ नहीं होगा बेटा। भगवान ने जो नसीब में लिखा है उसे कोई नहीं मिटा सकता। मुझे दे, मैं सब बातों को कैसे चुपचाप सह लेती हूँ। रवि भी तो तेरा ही भाई।
Humiliation, right?
तुम दोनों में कितना फर्क है?
You're so different, the two of you.
बहुत फर्क। सबसे बड़ा फर्क तो ये है।
Immediate cut to a train. There are number of places in the film where you see a cut to the train. Okay, in fact, one of the first scenes where you see a cut to the train is when she comes back. She's been tending to her husband who has been beaten up, right, because he's believed to have betrayed the workers, and she comes back. She's gone down the street to get some medicines. The people are taunting her on the roadside. And then when she comes back to the room, what does she find? She finds that he has absconded, he is left, and then immediately there is a cut to a train. I cannot underscore enough the importance of trains in the imagination of modern India. Right? That's one of the reasons why you are seeing these, because the trains, I mean, you know, you have a short article, so I'm not going to elaborate upon all aspects of the train, and the significance of the train journey in India. One of the things that the train journey in India did, among many other things, was to try to level caste differences. Because, you know, if you were on a train, and we have to think of mass transit systems as part of the history of a society, what it did was it brought together people who came from extraordinarily different backgrounds. And one of the arguments that's made by Richard Cronin in that short article that I'd assigned to you on Indian trains is the argument that the British had not really consciously thought of as such, but they did realize its implications, which was that one of the things that was happening under trains was some kind of notion of the unity emerging of a country which had been fragmented into pieces historically over a long period of time. That was one of the ways in which they were thinking. You know, if you think about what the trains were doing in India, they were creating new physical landscapes, they were creating new landscapes of pilgrimage, and in that sense, of course, they were assisting in the whole idea of mobility. I mean, this is one of the ways in which you move from the rural countryside to a great urban areas on a train. Right? And that is one reason why all of these scenes are punctuated by trains. And you know what this man is going to do, the father? He's going to basically ride the trains. You can't think of him as a hobo necessarily in the American sense, you know, but that's what he's doing, because he's become basically driftless. He's outside a community now for the time being, right? And that is why there's an extraordinary scene when his body is discovered and the policeman says, well, we found the body of this person and it's unclaimed. And then the younger son Ravi says, it is not unclaimed. See what's happening here? This man who has been othered is now reabsorbed back into the fold. All right? So that's the reason why the train is particularly important in a scene like this one here. So I want you to see the temple scene. Now you'll see another illustration of the match cut. We had seen a different one before because he's going to now be shown through a cut as grown up. Most priests are not so enlightened, of course, as this one. This is a very generous reading of a priest in a Hindi film, you know. Yeah. So we're going to try to just skip 20 seconds of this to get to So what's happened is the match cut, right? The bells were clinging, and suddenly both the boys are grown up.
तेरे लिए सुख और विजय के लिए शांति।
माँ, या तो मेरे बारे में तुम भगवान से सीरियस बात करती नहीं हो, या भगवान तुम्हारी बात सीरियसली सुनते नहीं।
So there's a very interesting question of Hindu religiosity in the Hindi film. You know, that all of these scenes where you see, okay, so they go into a temple, you look at the slum, and there are pictures of Hindu gods and goddesses. And you know, when a film like this came out in the mid-1970s, there were some people who were of secular kind of disposition who said that, well, you know, look, I mean, it's not that the film is making any argument for Hinduism as opposed to any other faith, but that these are all signs of religiosity, and that in a secular country we have to be attentive to how we show these signs of religiosity in a public way, right? And it's an interesting question. I mean, and I think we have to be able to make a distinction that the film is not advocating, obviously, for some kind of Hinduism. In fact, the interesting thing is that the principal character is basically a non-believer. You know, of course, you could say that he's a non-believer and he's the one who gets shot in the end. So someone there might sort of think about it and say that, well, you know, the virtuous are also those who are religious. I mean, who knows? Someone might be inclined to make that interpretation. But I think all of you would agree that this film can, by no stretch of the imagination, be considered a film that is advocating any kind of religiosity. But what is interesting is the fact that these scenes of religiosity have been naturalized, right? That is that they're just part of the scene now. They're part of the landscape. All right? Okay.
अरे बेटे, हो सकता है भगवान तुम्हारे लिए कोई अच्छी नौकरी ढूंढ रहे हो।
ओह, तो ये चक्कर है। वैसे कल तुम भगवान के काम में ये बात जरूर डाल देना कि ताकि मुझे तो पुलिसों की भी नौकरी मिले, तो मैं करूँगा।
क्या बोलता है तू?
थोड़ा बहुत मजाक है।
So we're just coming to the end of this scene.
भाई की जैसे मेरा भगवान से कोई झगड़ा वगड़ा नहीं।
कितने साल हो गए, मगर ये तू इसे समझाता क्यों नहीं?
बस तुम यही देखती हो कि भाई तुम्हारे मंदिर में नहीं आता, लेकिन तुम्हारे लिए रोज मंदिर की सीढ़ियों पर आकर बैठता है, ये नहीं देखती।
That's an important point, because it's a point about the fact that you can have a kind of faith, but it doesn't have to be. You can have a kind of devotion, but it doesn't have to be expressed in purely religious terms, right? So he makes the argument that you're not attentive to the fact that your older son, whom you're always criticizing because he never enters the temples, but he comes with you every day and he sits outside there, right? So prasad is the holy food after a service, you know. And just see how the scene is going to end. He's still looking for a job, right? Now notice, right? The divergent paths. Right? The divergent paths. The Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. You come to a fork, that's your life. Which fork do you take? Right? It's very simply done, but that's exactly what the film is going to do now, is that henceforth, of course it's happened before, but it's still a unit in a way, and henceforth what's going to happen is the paths will continue to diverge. They'll continue to diverge. All right? And I think that this is exactly the way in which a filmmaker like this is really working. So what we're going to do is we're going to see one last sequence, and this last sequence is very important because it gives you some sense of the culture of modern middle-class India and lower-class India as well, and what is the interaction of these cultures as well. Some sense of that, all right? So this is the scene where you will recall it, that there's this boy, and he is going to steal a loaf of bread, right, over here, and he's going to start running, and we're going to see for the next 3 minutes and see how it transpires. There is another chase later on where Ravi is chasing his brother, of course. The train again. Okay, so we'll just skip a few seconds of this in the interest of time. Those, by the way, those images there, you can't see them clearly, but those are again the framed images of the gods and goddesses. They're hungry, of course, right? You can tell her mouth is watering. Yeah. You know, of course, that, I mean, she says, go and shoot the people who are hoarding grain and who are engaging in black marketing, and that, of course, includes his brother. And so you go and shoot them, and of course, that's exactly what he's going to do, right? So the image over here, this image over here, big framed photograph, does anyone recognize this at all? Why, yes? Yeah. So an Indian audience, of course, would immediately know, right? Rabindranath Tagore. And who is Rabindranath Tagore? He's after Gandhi, possibly Nehru, but certainly after Gandhi and Nehru, the most well-recognized figure from India in the 20th century. Right? And who is he? He's an educator, founder of a university, Nobel Prize winner for literature, 1913, gigantic figure. But he represents this idea of the humanist. Now, the fact that this person, and who is he, by the way? We're going to have a little conversation where he's going to find out what is his profession. What is this man's profession? The father of the boy. Do you remember from anyone? Yeah, he's a teacher. He's a teacher. That's exceedingly important, because what is he going to do? He's going to ask him, "What is your profession?" And then he's going to bend down and he's going to touch his feet. Right? Because he says that the kind of view that I'm hearing from you, the enlightened view that I'm hearing from you, one can only hear from a teacher. Right? That this is a person that, teaching is a revered profession. Yes, maybe it doesn't pay very much, particularly if you're, kindergarten, high school teacher, that sort of thing. But it's a revered profession. Now that was the middle class culture. And this is the culture in which Ravi has grown up too, because of course, remember, he's gone to school, unlike his brother. Right? So you see, what he's giving you in this film is perforce automatically also a commentary on the idea of education in middle class culture in 20th century India. That's what he's really doing. And you understand a little bit of the sensibility of the father by virtue of the fact that he hangs a huge portrait of Rabindranath Tagore alongside the gods and goddesses. You know, if you look at this calendar here, for some of you will recognize that's Krishna and Radha, right? So this is a significance of this particular. And I'll just go back just a tad bit so you can get a better sense of how he frames the picture. And then we'll go to the end of the conversation. Notice there, the frame. Yeah? The frame picture. And that calendar there, that's the image of the god Krishna with his consort Radha. He's also it's not only the fact that his wife has spoken in rude terms to him, that there's a culture of hospitality that has been violated. Yes?
I just want to ask, so I found it interesting that the picture is more like is framed and by itself.
Yes.
And while the calendar with the god is a calendar. So
it's a calendar.
They're giving more reverence to, I'm sorry, I forgot, but to the picture frame than to the god, because it feels like that. You can certainly interpret it that way, although there are in the beginning, I pointed to the fact that there are framed pictures of the gods and goddesses as well in this room, which are smaller. But you see, the thing is that if we really were doing a class on public culture entirely and popular culture in India, calendar art is huge. All right? And so, this kind of calendar art is something that you find all over the country. You go to homes, you go to shops, you go to government offices, you'll find this kind of religious calendar art. And so one would have to ask questions about, well, how does religiosity come into the public sphere? Remember the question I just asked you 5 minutes ago. And one of the other ways it comes is through calendar art. Right? So I wouldn't necessarily make that inference because calendar art is very easily available, but it does suggest, in a sense, saying that your reading is something that I think we would have to take very seriously, because it does suggest the fact that he puts aside a portrait of Tagore, it's framed, it's in a prominent place by itself, he's giving it prominence, right? Because he's trying to suggest that this poor teacher may be poor, but he is a person who comes from an enlightened humanist kind of background, right? And this is the culture that someone like Ravi understands as well, because now look at the rest of the conversation and then we'll stop there.
लेकिन देखा जाए तो हिंदुस्तान में हजारों लोग भूखे मरते हैं तो क्या सब चोर हो जाए? नहीं, हमें आपसे कोई शिकायत नहीं, आपने जो किया ठीक किया.
Not quite, of course, because you can interpret it in two ways, that what you did as a policeman you did because it was within your right to do so, but I think most reasonable people would say shooting a boy, even if you didn't know what the boy was stealing, it could have been a case of jewelry, in principle. Although if he's stealing from a person with a cart on the street, it's not going to be that. It's going to be an apple or an orange or, in this case, a loaf of bread. But shooting seems to be a fairly extreme reaction,
मैं म्यूनिसिपल टीचर था, पिछले साल रिटायर हूँ, आजकल कुछ ट्यूशन कर लेता हूँ. इतनी बड़ी शिक्षा किसी टीचर के घर से ही मिल सकती थी.
There is a little bit of sanctimoniousness, if I may put it this way, to put it mildly. The kind of sentimentality the Hindi film really loves, and this is, I think, a very good illustration of that. But I would sort of dismiss that, and then I would try to get the analytical import, and the analytical import has to do with the place of education in middle class life in India. I don't know how many of you keep up with the spelling bee, which, you know, the New York Times had a huge article on that recently, because the most recent spelling bee was won by 8 students, and 7 of them, 7 are Indians. And in the last 14 years, Indians have won the spelling bee for 12 years. For 12 years. So there's a huge article in the New York Times inquiring as to why Indians were dominating, and the person they asked, I think his answer is woefully inadequate, but one of the explanations he gave, he said, well, you know, in middle-class families, we value, in Indian middle-class families, we value education. We insist on the virtues of education. No, I think most families insist on the virtue of education, whether you're Indian or Chinese or anyone else. But nonetheless, that was the argument given over here. And I'm suggesting to you that once you strip this veneer of sentimentality, then you still say that, well, you know, there's an interesting insight into middle-class culture, into the idea of veneration for a teacher, which almost seems a little bit archaic in modern culture, particularly in a culture like this one, I would argue, you know, right? So forth and so on. Right? So, yes, Dominic.
How does this veneration of teaching square with this problem that we talked about earlier in the course, where you have like massive rates of absenteeism
Yeah.
for teachers? I mean, like, so how do you keep how do both of these sort of values survive when
Yes.
we highly value them, but many of them are obviously not doing their
No,
job?
but you see, partly that has to do with, you know, if you're looking at rural schools, we talked about that a little bit. If you're looking at rural schools, I mean, you've got problems at both ends. You've got problems with the teachers, and you've got problems with the students. Most of the students will not go there, except because you get a midday lunch. Okay, you get a midday lunch, because many families still view these children, once they've gone to school, as children who therefore are depriving their families of possible revenue, because they could have easily been working somewhere else during the day if they had gone, so forth and so on. Although, you know, if you do look at oral histories, most people who come from extremely poor working class families will always tell you that they would rather send their children to school than send them to work, you know, at a mill or at a carpet weaving factory or whatever the case may be. But to go straight to your question, there's no necessary contradiction there, because the problem in rural areas in part also has to do, number one, with the paucity of resources on both sides. Teachers' salaries are extraordinarily inadequate in many of these places. What they've found also is that you don't actually even have functioning schools. So there's no incentive on the part of the teacher to go. And then, of course, in some of these places in rural India, this is based on patronage systems. Yeah, a person gets appointed as a teacher not because they have a credentials as a teacher, but because it is a system of political patronage, and a political party gets to benefit from it. You know, right? So that would be the brief answer. There's no necessary contradiction. That's what I'm trying to suggest to you between the two things that you've pointed out. All right. All right. So you know, I'd love to show you other scenes, but I think you have a very good sense of some of the major themes, not simply of the film, but how these themes actually intersect with larger questions having to do with Indian history. So does anybody have any questions? Because at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on to you know, the next question, which is, as I said, the question of public culture in India, public culture and street culture, and how we're to interpret that and what is its real meaning. You know. Okay. So the way I would like you to think about it is, I would like you to think about the history of everyday life. Now, I don't think we should only be thinking, as I said, about political institutions and such grand things as Parliament and the Supreme Court and what these institutions do, or what have been the ideological agendas. I think that sometimes we have to think about things like everyday life. You know, what is the nature of everyday life? And how does one actually write the history of everyday life? Because if you think about everyday life, we are saying let's take a collectivity, but just for a moment, let's take an individual. I mean, if you take an individual's life, someone you pick from the street randomly, you might say there's really nothing that interesting. I mean, a person wakes up in the morning, they brush their teeth, you know, they take a shower, have a breakfast, go to work, come back home, sit in front of the TV, watch a Netflix serial for 3 hours, and then the next day rolls on, right? That's how you think about everyday life. But when we view it as a collectivity, are we able to make different arguments about the structure of everyday life, the nature of public culture, yeah? And what does it even mean to speak about street culture? I'm not sure that in a place like Los Angeles one can really speak of street culture anymore. I mean, if somebody here wanted to persuade me that 3rd Street Santa Monica represents street culture, then I don't think we understand what street culture actually really means. All right? So the question would be, what is the nature of this street life, street culture, and what windows does it actually offer into the larger public and political sphere? And if you've read the article that was assigned to you by Arjun Aputhurai on street culture, one of the most remarkable features of street life, it is still there. It is slowly disappearing from the large metropolitan cities. All right? But it's still there in large segments of it. But what is that one particular feature which is absolutely distinct? That one feature, there are many others that are important too, but one that really distinguishes it from street life, let's say in a Western European capital, okay, to the extent that you get street culture in, let's say, Amsterdam or Paris, which would be more so than what you get in the United States. And that is the fact that the most intimate things in life, barring sexual acts, are to be seen on the street. You can walk down an Indian street in an old neighborhood such as Chandni Chowk. I'm going to show you some slides of that, and you'll find people who are being given a cut by the barber. They're having a haircut. Someone who's being shaved by the barber. You want to have your ears cleaned. I strongly advise no one to do that on an Indian street corner because you'll almost certainly get infected. But you can go to a person who's called an ear cleaner. You're walking down a street, and he'll insert some implement into your ear and take out the wax. Now, these are intimate bodily functions in a way, and they're being done on the street. People, of course, cook on the street, and you might be cooking an elaborate meal on a street. So, one of the things I think I would urge you to think about is, when did this distinction between the public and the private become an entrenched part of the thinking of the modern West? Because what I'm suggesting to you is that this distinction still does not carry the weight that it does in the West. You know that there are things in the West which are viewed as being strictly within the private sphere. The activities of the bedroom are strictly of the private sphere. Intimate relations between spouses, but also intimate actions having to do with the body, with keeping the body clean, with bathing. And then, of course, we know that today when we speak about privacy, what we are speaking about is privacy rights and privacy concerns, emanating from such things as the presence of social media. To what extent can a state encroach upon you and demand information? Right? That's the domain in which we think about privacy. But if you read, let's say, a major theorist, philosopher like Michel Foucault, one of the things that he's going to argue is that essentially, and he's not the first person to make this distinction, there are others who have been working on this distinction for quite some period of time, but that this distinction between the public and the private really is a distinction that goes back to the late 18th century, right? And it marks the emergence of what is called the subject, right? Where you have the notion of subjectivity, the subject, the individual, the individuation of a person. That is the creation of the right of privacy in the 18th century. Then there are institutional forms of it, of course. And those institutional forms have to do with what is it that the state can actually demand of you, what kind of information it should not be privy to, so forth and so on. Right? But in this context that we're looking at, what we're saying is that a public thoroughfare of some kind is actually the domain for what would be considered highly private acts in countries of the modern West. That's what we're talking about, and that's what Arjun Apodhara is talking about in his article on street culture as well. Now, to highlight how one can understand, okay, what the changes have been, I want to give you an account from a West Delhi neighborhood called Rajouri Garden, which is a neighborhood that I grew up in. Okay, the neighborhood that I grew up in, and the story that I'm going to tell you is a story which is the story of my own family and how the changes in that street tell us about how India was changing from the 1960s to the 1990s, a period of nearly 3 decades. So in 1969, I came back with my parents after having spent 4 years in Japan to my father's home, which he had built there in the early 1960s. Now, the lane that we lived in, I don't have a photograph of it right now. I should have put that into the slide so you could have seen the street, but I'd have to dig through all my old photographs. All right? But the lane that we lived in had approximately, I would say, 50 homes, single-family homes. It was a middle-class neighborhood. This neighborhood only came into existence early 1960s, late 1950s at best. When my father moved in there, when he built the home, he told me that there were snakes in that area because right behind where the home was built was basically a kind of a jungle. All right? And just to give you some sense of where this is, this neighborhood of West Delhi is approximately 15 kilometers from central New Delhi. Okay? Today, of course, it's considered part of New Delhi completely, but back then it was still a little bit on the outskirts. And so I'm talking about roughly about 55, 60 years ago, 55 to 65 years ago, the period that I'm really talking about. Right? That when he built a home with a government loan, my father was an employee of the Indian Diplomatic Service, it was essentially a jungle for the most part. And that's why there were snakes there. All right? Now, when we came back in 1969, my father brought back with him a black and white television. It was the first television in the entire lane. And remember, this is a middle-class neighborhood I'm speaking about. Now, in those days, there was only one television channel in India called Doordarshan. One television channel, all of India. State-run television. Used to run from 5 in the evening to 11 in the evening. 6 hours a day. And every day on the dot at 6 o'clock, you had a half-hour program called Krishi Darshan, which is a program for farmers. So basically, they would have instructions on about what to do with a farm, what kind of irrigation methods to use, what are the changes, right? So the state saw its role as one of development, right? That's what it was really doing. However, once a week, they showed a mainstream commercial Hindi film, a Bollywood film. Once a week. Sunday at 6 p.m. is when the film would begin. Now, since my father, when he brought back the television, this was the only television set in the whole lane, the entire neighborhood would come to our home to watch the film. Okay, 1969. And this meant that my brother and myself, we couldn't watch the film because we had to tend to everybody else. There were 50 people crammed into that living room. Now, in 1972, we left for Indonesia. By the time we left in 1972, there were approximately 10 television sets in that entire lane. And you knew exactly how many there were. I don't know how many of you know how you would know. It's very easy. An aerial, an overhead aerial, which you put on the roof. And you could tell from that right away who had a television set. So when we left in 1972, at that time in the evening, on a Sunday evening, when that film would be shown, there would be about 8 to 10 people who would show up. Because now they had scattered to the other homes too. Remember, there are about 10 television sets. Some people didn't permit their neighbors to come and watch. So you still had a disproportionate number of people in some homes and, you know, very few in the other homes. When we came back in 1974 to India, after having lived in Indonesia for 2 years, we found, when we came back, that there were 25 sets. Okay, 25 sets. But when we turned on our television set on that Sunday evening, because people found out what kind of TV we had, we still had 30 people who showed up, because we had the first color television set in that lane, since my father had brought it from overseas. Now you see that this is the sociology of everyday life. What's happening, you're seeing consumption. People are buying television sets. It's becoming a little bit more common. And there was still only one TV station, state-run. Okay? And I'm talking about 1974. When we left in 1976, nearly everyone in that lane had a television set, but ours was still the only color one. Okay? Now, 1980 came back from Washington, D.C. And what we found this time was that everyone had a color television set. You had 3 TV stations now, all state managed, Doordarshan 1, 2, 3. Okay, all state managed. There was no private television channel at this point in time. And the most astonishing thing was, when it came back in 1980, all right, that lots of people still showed up at our home for that Sunday. And the reason for that, very simply, is because Sony. We had the first imported color television set. And then in 1982, we come back again from a trip, long stay overseas, and we find that everyone has a color television set in that lane, and some people have an imported color television set, but no one has a VCR. How many of you know what a VCR is? Okay, most of you, not everyone. All right? You know, that was the technology of those days. And not only was it a VCR, but it was a VCR that was a triple system VCR, because, you know, they used different systems in Europe and in India and the United States, so it had to be a triple system. And you had to be able to work it with that television set. So you needed a triple system color set and a triple system VCR in order to make it work in India. Now you notice what's happening here. What I'm giving you is, I'm giving you a window into the history of everyday life in a middle-class neighborhood in India. That's how you would begin to construct that history. What you think to yourself is, okay, how did consumption levels increase? There is a growth in the middle class. There's no question about that. The middle class is becoming more affluent. And you remember what I had argued for you about 4 or 5 weeks ago, that one of the fundamental problems in the creation of the middle class in India was that this was not a middle class that understood that, historically speaking, the middle class is a class that is devoted in its origins to the idea of goods in common. How did the public library system arise in the United States? How did public schools arise? How did lighting become so important and so visible all across the country? Because the middle class was deeply invested in the idea of common social goods. But here what we are seeing is a middle class that is really being measured by the idea of consumption. And of course, there are other parts of the story which I've not highlighted, but I've mentioned them to you. It'll be up to you to do the work of interpretation. For example, the fact that all media was essentially state-controlled. Now remember, this is not the Soviet Union that you're really talking about. But I'm talking about, when I say all media, I'm talking about television. I'm not talking about newspapers. Newspapers were not state controlled. There were newspapers that were sympathetic to the state. But if you look at Indian middle class culture, we would also have to look at the role of the newspaper. That scene in Deewaar, I didn't point it out explicitly, but now if you go back to that scene, the one with the teacher, he's reading the newspaper. He's reading the newspaper. You know? And a lot of middle class culture in India is defined by the addiction to the newspaper. In a city such as New Delhi, you have over 10 English language newspapers that are daily newspapers even today. Over 10 daily newspapers. And the same newspaper, such as the Indian Express, sometimes gets published from 20-25 cities, you know, and the names of the cities are recorded under the masthead of the newspapers, you know. All right, so this is the way in which you would begin to start exploring middle class culture, the culture of everyday life, and the sociological portrait of India and how this is changing over a period of time. Now, when we think of street culture, I think it's also essential to make to recognize that there are many different kinds of roads and thoroughfares, streets and alleys. And in many countries, when we think about streets, we also have to think about how certain institutions attempt to exercise control over the streets. Sometimes it might be just gangs. If you're looking, for example, at Los Angeles, you'll have to really look at how gangs carve out streets and neighborhoods which become their territory. Right, which become essentially their territory. And one of the ways in which states attempt to control streets is to, for example, change names, something that I've discussed at some length with you. We have to be able to make distinction between neighborhood streets and major roads. If you look, for example, at this over here, okay? Now this is called Rajpath. So this is the structure that you see over here. This is called India Gate. This is a memorial built by the British. So this is what is called Lutyens, New Delhi. Lutyens is the name of the architect, Edward Lutyens. And New Delhi was designed as a capital by the British in the 1920s. Okay, in the 1920s, it was designed by them. There's another major architect. His name is Sir Herbert Baker, who had worked in South Africa before as well. And this is one of the major thoroughfares. If you look at this thoroughfare over here, you can see that it's a little grand. Of course, you're not getting the full sense of it because I have to give you a good aerial shot of that. But this is a major thoroughfare. A thoroughfare like this does not really permit of street culture in the same sense in which a narrow alley does, right? And you know that one of the reasons why many of these cities that are relatively new have large, wide roads is so that you can actually use the roads to bring in tanks and troops if necessary. That was one of the major transformations in Paris in the 19th century after the revolutions of 1848. All right? It's one of the major transformations in the city of Lucknow in North India, which after the rebellion of 1857, what the British did was they completely destroyed the old city, because they said the problem with these oriental cities of old is that you have these narrow alleys and streets, and you don't know what these natives are hatching. They're hatching some plot against us. You know, and rumors spread, and we can't send in tanks and troops. So they leveled the entire old city, and they built massive thoroughfares of this kind around the portion that had been much of old Lucknow. And this is something that you find in many other Indian cities as well. And here, by the way, this is the same street. This is the other end of it. You know what this is? This is the largest gathering of yoga practitioners done explicitly with the purpose of making sure that it got into the Guinness Book of Records. So Narendra Modi did it in 2015, leading 40,000 Indians, you know, to yoga. You know that there's a whole political debate about who owns yoga, which has been going on, because yoga begins in India, but there are many people in the West who practice it who couldn't care less where it came from. And there are many Hindus who have argued that its Hindu origins have been obscured by these liberals and Hollywood actors and actresses and California beatniks and all of that, people who love yoga. So that's what the debate is about, all right? But this is the same, and there what you see is part of Lutyens' New Delhi. This is the secretariat that was built by the British, all right? It goes back to those times. And here is the article from where it was taken, and you can see here where they talk about how this event is going to be brought into the Guinness Book of Records for the largest yoga or demonstration or class at a single venue. All right? Now this is a different street. And of course it is precisely in these kinds of streets that something called street culture is possible. So this is what is called Chandni Chowk. So literally Chandni is silver, okay, and Chowk is thoroughfare. So this used to be a neighborhood whose history goes back 500 years to Mughal period, and it was the place where wealth was concentrated. There are immense markets here, but these are all markets basically that are run off from these streets, all right? And you can see the density, the sheer density. I'm not even showing you the narrowest alleys, because in the narrowest alleys you cannot take these cycle rickshaws through them at all. It's not possible to do that in some of the narrowest alleys there. This is another view of the same streets, and this is the same neighborhood. This is a spice market. There are thousands of such markets, okay? So that's what we're really speaking about. And of course, to understand what this transition means, you think about something like this. Okay? This is also the transition to the week that we're looking at now, because this is where you shop now. If you are a middle-class Indian, you go to one of these malls, which could be anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world, with the same stores, the same chains. Yes, there are a few Indian brands and so on, but you're going to find virtually all the major international brands in these kinds of malls. And you know, there are people who have made all kinds of arguments, as indeed they should be made, against malls of this kind. But I can tell you that one of the reasons why Indians flock to these malls in the summer is because they're fully air conditioned. They're fully air conditioned. And if you want to save on an astronomical air conditioning bill in your own home, most of the people who go there don't have air conditioning to begin with, if they go for that reason. But if you want to save it, you go to one of these malls. The other reason why people go there is because they obviously maintain a level of cleanliness and all of that, which has been a major issue in Indian streets for a very long period of time, right? So, you know, when you think about this, don't simply register this as a change from, okay, now people were shopping in Chandni Chowk, you know, there's this density of crowds there, and now they're shopping, you know, at these luxurious malls and ease and so on. What is going to be transformed, as I'm going to argue in my next lecture, is an entire way of life. Right? We're going to have to think about what this form of globalization is signifying for a culture of that kind. All right? But let's just go back now to this idea of street culture that I was really talking about. And I've already indicated to you that when we look at these streets, we have to view these as places which subvert the distinction between the public and the private. And I also want to remind you that the street in India is not simply a visual spectacle, but it is an unusual auditory setting, where all kinds of sounds are coming. And one of the most distinctive features of pre-modern life, extending to some degree into modern India, but it's almost disappeared now, is that every hawker had a special cry depending on what they were selling. So, you know, you would cry out loud, you would shout what it is that you were selling, if you were selling potatoes or onions or fruit, or if you were a knife sharpener, you know, that was what the person was doing. So they had a particular call, they had a particular way, and this was part of that auditory culture of the street, right, which is slowly disappearing from India. All right? And then the change that I mentioned to you, but we'll explore its implications in greater detail later on. that is the transition to modern shopping malls. All right. Now, one particular aspect that I want to look at for a few minutes is street food. Right? And again, it's very important to understand. These are not random anecdotes here that we're talking about here. That there is a fundamental transformation in how we think about what it means to do history. That you cannot simply write, which is why now there are people who are looking into such things as culinary histories. What is a history of food in a particular culture? What is the relationship of cuisines? How do they develop? Right? If I asked you randomly, let's do it for a second. Let's see what the answer is. Okay? What does Indian food mean to those of you who are not South Asian in particular? Okay? Yeah. Curries. Okay, name me 2, 3 other things. Spicy. And how about a particular dish? Which one might it be? Paneer. Okay. Naan. Tandoori chicken. Yeah. Okay. Butter chicken. Tandoori chicken, butter chicken. Okay. All right. That's enough. Now you see what's happening here? Paneer, butter chicken, tandoori chicken, naan. Which particular cuisine of India do they come from? It's North Indian. You go to the state of Goa, you go to Kerala, you go to Andhra, you go to Bengal, the food is entirely different. You go to the south, to Tamil Nadu, the food is entirely different. See, what every culture does is, or it's not so much what it does, it's what is done to it, is that a complex culture will always get homogenized, particularly in a diasporic setting. So, you know, if it's Indian food, you say that, well, there are 100 cuisines in India, but it has all come down to samosas, tandoori chicken, butter chicken, naan. And all the restaurants sound and look exactly the same, barring a few here or there. Right? I mean, you know, Great Britain has 15,000 Indian restaurants. And London alone has 2,000 Indian restaurants. And they even have a competition, by the way, every year for the best curry, the best chicken tikka masala, which was invented, by the way, in Britain. Okay? And now everybody thinks it's synonymous with Indian food. Right? You see what's happening? That it's all becoming homogenized, especially in the diasporic setting. Now, one of the things that street food did in India was it played the role of national integration. Amazingly enough, the first dosa, there are a few of you here who might know what a dosa is. It's a South Indian dish done on a huge pan. And, you know, there can be different kinds of dosas, but typically it's very crisp. Think of a crepe if you want to, but the big dosa can be that big. Okay? The first dosa that North Indians had was on the streets in Delhi. Right? All of these street foods, and I can tell you, India is an absolute veritable paradise for street food. I have one strong recommendation, but before you go and imbibe any of this, just take antibiotics for a few days. All right? I strongly recommend that. And then you can eat at your will and at your pleasure, you know, because all of this food is extraordinarily attractive, but this is exactly, there are no sanitary standards here. No one is wearing gloves. You know, you just, and you know, the guy could have gone and peed 5 minutes ago, and then he might be serving you the food, you know, for all you know. Now, of course, they try to pretend that, well, you know, we're adhering to some standards. The same dishes people will eat, they're washed right there with, you know, a half an ounce of water, and then the next person will get it, so forth and so on. But you see, what I'm suggesting to you is that when we're looking at something like street food, you know, what it did was it introduced regional cuisines. Of course, albeit in small doses, and very particular parts of these regional cuisines, you know. And in that sense, street food and street culture was always avant-garde. It was always ahead of the game. Before the cultural theorists and political theorists came about and started talking about national integration and unity and all of that, the vendors on Indian streets had already taken the pulse of the situation and figured out that there was actually a demand for all of these snacks which were coming from different parts of India. All right? So this is the reason why histories of food, and particularly street food, can be a very useful way of understanding not just how a country is changing, but even such things as national agendas and the whole ideology of unity, integrity, and so on. Okay, we stop here.